Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and this is episode 622 of People Behind the Science. This week, we are excited to revisit our interview with Dr. Jennifer Grandis, originally published on September 4th of 2015. Listeners, Jennifer specializes in a particular kind of head and neck cancer called head and neck squamous cell carcinoma. She studies the signals involved in the development and progression of this type of cancer with the goal of identifying key pathways that could be targets for therapeutic intervention. Jennifer's work spans the translational pipeline from mechanistic studies in preclinical models all the way to clinical trials in people to evaluate new treatment strategies. And listeners, we hope you are ready to learn more about Jennifer's life and work in this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. Today, I am excited to introduce you all to Dr. Jennifer Grandis. So, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, we are excited to chat with you and learn a little bit about your experiences in life and science. So let me start by introducing you to our listeners. Listeners, Jennifer is a professor in the Department of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery, Director of the Clinical and Translational Science Institute, and Associate Vice Chancellor of Clinical and Translational Research at the University of California, San Francisco. She is also an American Cancer Society professor. Now, Jennifer received her bachelor's degree in biology and art history at Swarthmore College and was awarded her MD from the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. She completed her residency and an Infectious Disease Fellowship at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine and went on to serve on the faculty there for over 20 years before accepting her current position at UCSF. Now, Jennifer has received many awards and honors during her career, including the Peggy Wheelock Award for Excellence in Research, Mentoring, and Promotion of Women in Science from the University of Nebraska, as well as the University of Pittsburgh's Provost Award for Excellence in Mentoring, the Hench Distinguished Alumnus Award, the Chancellor's Distinguished Research Award, Scientific Leadership Award, as well as promotion to Distinguished Professor of Otolaryngology, and more. Now, Jennifer is also an elected member of the Association of American Physicians, the American Society for Clinical Investigation, and the Institute of Medicine of the National Academies. And she's here with us today, listeners, to tell us about her journey through life and science. So, Jennifer, today we want to chat with you. We want to get to know you, both as a scientist and also as a person. So can you start off our interview by telling us what you like to do when you're not doing science?
Oh, well, lots of things. Every day, my husband and I get up, and with our dogs, we go for a run. And that's time to catch up and enjoy this beautiful new city, which is San Francisco. And every day I read because I love to read. It's been a source of comfort my entire life. I listen to books on my iPhone as I travel around the city and go from campus to campus. And I sit in bed every night and I read the newspaper and the book, and it makes me really happy. And I love to cook. It makes me happy as well, feeding other people, and plus I really love to eat.
Right. Me as well. I'm definitely an eater, but not much of a cooker, so I enjoy going to other people's houses and enjoying what they can concoct. Now, Jennifer, you mentioned you are a dog person. Can you tell us a little bit about your dogs?
Well, we have an older dog, a mature dog, who's a German short-hair pointer. His name is Stryker. He's 13, and we were amazed that he survived the journey across the United States of America, and that he's able to go up and down the streets and hills in San Francisco. But he's our boy. And then we have a much younger dog, just recently graduated from puppyhood, named Juno, and she's a golden doodle, or as we call her, our designer mutt. And she's much more high energy curve than our older dog.
Gotcha. Well, wonderful to get a window into your life outside of science, Jennifer, but we do want to talk about the science next. So can you tell us how you describe what you do to someone who might not be familiar with your field?
I am a cancer biologist in addition to being a head and neck surgeon. And what I try to do in my scientific life is really determine the key features of the cancer, and in my case, it's head and neck cancer because I'm a nose and throat doctor, those features that can be exploited to develop more effective treatments.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful description, and we're excited to hear more about your work as we go through the interview. But let's chat about motivation for a moment here. I know there is so much to get done in a day as a scientist, as a physician. It's hard to fit everything in. So do you have a favorite motivational quote or saying that you like to keep in your mind as you go through your day?
Not Really, and it's not because I don't think motivational quotes are inspiring. It's just none of them come back to me organically. But I guess when I think about how do I find motivation, the key features for me are creating situations where I am the rate limiting step, where it's really my capacities that can drive the kinetics or impose brakes on situations, as opposed to feeling frustrated by situations or other people or factors that I don't have any control over. So try to let those things go and really focus on the aspects of my day-to-day life that I have control over.
I like it. And I think as a scientist, like I said, there's so much to get done. You often feel out of control of your schedule, of the things that you have to get done. So it's nice to find those things that you have control of and try and make your world fit into that box where you're controlling what you're delegating and what you're in charge of and what needs to get done in a day. So fantastic. Now, can you tell us a little bit about people who've inspired or motivated you over the course of career? I think as a scientist, you work with so many brilliant, inspirational people. Can you share some of your own role models?
There have been sort of two categories of role models for me. I started my life in medicine as a clinician, and I'm still really inspired by the profoundly dedicated clinicians. It's a really challenging life. Patients who are experiencing life-threatening diagnoses, and in this case, cancer, it's a real privilege and responsibility to be part of their life and the lives of their family when they're going through the diagnosis and treatment. And I've always been inspired by my clinical mentors who are welcomed into a social situation where they have a special skill set. When the patient appears to be cured, it's exhilarating. And when the cancer is really recalcitrant and recurs and is responsible for the death of the patient, it can be enormously challenging and frustrating. So finding people in my life who've been able to sustain careers that cope with that kind of intensity and responsibility has been really inspiring. And on the other hand, I've been really inspired by mentors, people who recognize that their own contributions are primarily going to be the training of young people and the development of others' careers, and finding intense gratification by nurturing the next generation of investigators is quite inspiring, because if we all play by ourselves with our own toys, we will be much less successful than if we work together.
Right. Now, Jennifer, you've been recognized for your own mentorship of students of the next generation of scientists and physicians. So can you tell us a little bit about how that has played into your career and how that fits into your everyday?
It's so organic, and I think I'm also a parent. One of my PhD students, my MD PhD student, just graduated actually on Monday. And when he was thanking the community at the time of his graduation, he referred to me as his scientific mother.
Aww.
And I sometimes think that those two roles are on a spectrum. Of course, one has a very different experience of one's children than one does of students and fellows, but it's a similar kind of an ego investment in that the needs of a trainee or the professional child are more important in some ways than our own personal needs. And it's been very satisfying because I recognize that I have a limited capacity for new ideas, to create new collaborations and drive science forward in unexpected ways. And so by nurturing the talents of others and helping them find their own motivation, it has been enormously gratifying, because it allows me to feel just a little bit responsible for the development of knowledge and the contributions to human health on a larger scale.
Well, this sounds like a wonderful mentoring relationship you have with your students. I love this idea of their scientific mother. That's a fantastic term there. Now, I know this is a really important aspect, training the next generation of students, but I want to go back in your timeline now and hear a little bit about how you got interested in science and medicine. So can you take us back to the beginning now, Jennifer, and tell us how it all started?
It's a circuitous career, I think, for most people. I went to college, as you know, and I was a small liberal arts college. It was about inquiry, it was about expression, it's a Quaker school, it was about community and consensus, and it was extraordinarily inspiring and ironically and gratifying that my oldest child just graduated from Michigan College this past year. So it was really nice to come back in time and see he's a very different person and not interested in science and medicine, but the school is really about being a great person and being the kind of individual who gave back to the world. And so I majored in art history because I loved it, and I majored in biology because I thought that was practical. Mm-hmm. And then I went to medical school because I wanted to help people and wasn't particularly interested in being a scientist. What happened was I became a surgeon because it gave me the feeling, sometimes the illusion, of being able to cure people by cutting out bad things. And I saw the limitations of the surgical approach. Sometimes it was effective, but just as often it wasn't in terms of cancer. And we were rather impotent to help our patients because we didn't have a deep understanding of the biology of the cancer. For complicated reasons, cancers that have historically been associated with behaviors like smoking have been somewhat understudied, and head and neck cancer until very recently was really thought to be a self-inflicted cancer. So it was not as well studied as other cancers like, let's say, breast cancer or prostate cancer. Mm-hmm. So I felt that if I really was going to help my patients who were dying of this horrible disease, and the surgeries we were doing sometimes weren't helping, more often really diminishing their quality of life by impairing their ability to swallow or speak and disfiguring them, that I really needed to understand the biology. And so I was motivated by the problems I couldn't solve in the clinic to go back into a laboratory setting and learn about cancer biology and then try to put those two worlds together.
Certainly. Well, this sounds like a fantastic journey to bring you to science and medicine. I'm fascinated by this interest in art history. Is this something you still get to indulge in now and then?
Oh, all the time. It's wonderful because my mother was an art history major, and we travel a lot together, and we go to museums constantly, and my son really enjoys museums as well, did a lot of museum work, when he was a high school student, undergraduate. So I'm not sure I would call it art history so much as I really enjoy art, and I really enjoy experiencing art, and it's great to be in places where there's lots of opportunities to do that.
Certainly. We love to showcase how scientists have diverse interests and how you can fit it all into your life. And I think you're a great example of this. And I'm curious to hear a little bit about what brought you to San Francisco. So how did you get from that point of starting to get interested in research and medicine to now where you are today?
Life in Pittsburgh was enormously satisfying. I'm from Pittsburgh as well. I was born and raised there, and having my children experience their grandparents in a really intimate way was glorifying. It was just wonderful for the grandparents and wonderful for the children, and we're all deeply grateful that we had the opportunity to live close to each other for those 20 years. And my husband is a physician. He's a cardiologist and was in private practice in Pittsburgh. And so when we thought about moving, it was always very challenging to move his skill set to a new place because his currency were his patients. And of course, his patients weren't going to leave their homes in one city and move to another city.
Right.
And then it would be, we would uproot the children and force them to start over in their schools, which there's plenty of positive aspects of that, but it was always a big question. And then we would separate the children and the grandparents. And so frankly, at some point, once they both went to high school, we determined that we weren't going to do that and we would just stay in Pittsburgh. And it was great. Life was wonderful. But our children finally left for college, and we decided, my husband and I, that if we ever were going to live in another city and work professionally, now was the time to do it. In our early 50s, and the feeling was, if we waited much later, we wouldn't have as much energy or enthusiasm.
Sure.
And I've just always felt an affinity for this part of the country. I really love the idea of going to a public institution of incredibly talented faculty and trainees, and that's exactly what this is. So when this opportunity came up, we both decided that this kind of change was something we were eager to experience, and it's only been a few months, but so far so good.
Certainly. And I know you've taken on a lot of new roles as part of this move. So can you tell us a little bit about how it's going so far? Have there been any unexpected things that have come up, or have you found that there are certain things that you like more than you thought you would?
Scientifically, it's glorious. I mean, I miss my colleagues and collaborators in Pittsburgh, but it's very invigorating to come to a new place where there are new ideas, new ways of doing things. And I've been able to recruit a significantly more talented pool of trainees because they want to come to UCSF and live in San Francisco and be part of this program. So the lab is exciting and the interactions are exciting. And so that part has been as invigorating as I expected it would be, although, of course, there's some downtime and startup time that one has to cope with.
Sure.
The administrative job is really exciting because it turns out that what I really love doing is listening to people, learning about them, and trying to identify opportunities to solve problems. And this job is allowing me to do that, and it's very satisfying. It's hard to change cultures or communities that are really invested, the way that they are. But if a community or culture has just sort of lacked maybe a little bit of coordination or somebody to own the problem to solve, it's easier. And so I'm finding that this community is very eager to solve the problems. They just to date haven't had necessarily someone in the position who's been empowered to do so. So it's early, but I'm inspired and encouraged.
Definitely. Now, diving into the research side of what you're working on now, can you share with us a little bit more in detail about one of these projects you're working on that you are just the most excited to be working on in the lab?
So I alluded to previously that historically head and neck cancers have been primarily associated with smoking. And over the last maybe 5 to 10 years, there's increasing recognition and now I think an acceptance that a significant number of head and neck cancers are caused by infection with the human papillomavirus, or HPV. And we know that these patients are different, particularly if they never smoked. They tend to be younger, and they tend to have a better prognosis, but many of them still die of their cancer. And so as part of teams of investigators around the country who have been trying to unravel the genetic underpinnings of these cancers, we've determined that the HPV-associated head and neck cancers are different. And in particular, they have a much higher frequency of a gene that is thought to drive cancer called an oncogene that is mutated in these cancers. And so it turns out that there are drugs that are in clinical development that can block the pathway that's turned on by this oncogene. So we're about to open a trial to test the hypothesis that if we give these patients with HPV-positive head and neck cancer a drug that blocks this pathway that is more frequently altered in these patients, that we will be able to cure them with reduced toxicity. So that seems like a really nice marriage between laboratory science and modeling and then immediately helping patients.
Certainly. I think this precision medicine approach is really exciting, thinking about all the potential in the future for it as well.
Yeah.
So fantastic to hear more about your research. And I know as a clinician and scientist, you kind of have an interesting perspective on it because you get to see the clinical side as well as the basic research side. So do you feel like both of those two areas are inspiring and informing each other?
Oh, absolutely. The patients remind me about how important it is to experience the just natural disappointments that accompany science. I mean, clinical medicine is mostly about helping people and feeling like a superhero. And science is often about feeling frustrated and disappointed. I mean, most manuscripts don't get accepted. Most grants don't get funded. A lot of experiments fail, and it's about persisting in light of some of the day-to-day disappointments, and seeing patients and understanding what they are going through is a real inspiration to keep focusing.
Certainly. And speaking of these disappointments, these challenges, I know every scientist, every clinician goes through them in some capacity at some point in their career. And Jennifer, we love to highlight these experiences because I think it gives the public an idea of what life is like as a scientist, some of the things that you face, some of the challenges you encounter, but also it gives aspiring scientists an idea of what they're getting into. So can you take us back to a point in your career and share with us one of these challenges and how you worked through it?
Well, the first example that comes to mind was I had developed an approach to cancer. It was a gene therapy approach, but it was around the time that there was a death at another institution that caused the NIH and the other regulatory agencies at the federal level to stop all gene therapy trials, to go back and retest all the different factors that were going into the gene therapy treatment to make sure that we didn't have any more deaths.
Oh, wow.
So this was late 1990s, and I was doing a gene therapy trial. We had to stop, and we had to go through some more testing, and it turned out that the gene that we had given to the first 13 patients, while it hadn't hurt them, it had been inadvertently the control gene, the control gene that we had used in our studies in the laboratory. So the laboratory that made the gene for us for the trial simply got the wrong material. And
oh, no.
Oh, yes. And I was 100% responsible because I was the principal investigator. So I had been publicly graded, and I was put on probation as a principal investigator, and I just felt terrible. But what I realized was that we really hadn't done the right trial, and that there was great hope that the approach would work. And so after I recovered from my ego assault,
sure,
I persisted. I went back to square one and did the study. And the study was successful. Not only did we not hurt people, but we cured 2 people, and we helped an additional 5 others. And this was on a very small 13-patient trial. So it was really surprisingly successful. And we now have just finished what is called a phase 2 trial. And so I learned that taking responsibility is hard, and particularly I was an assistant professor, and being publicly held responsible is even harder. But at the end of the day, it's about helping people, and then getting back on the horse and doing the right work ended up being very successful. So suck it up and move on.
Yeah. I think this is a really important story to share with our listeners. And I think this is a really important example of how science has this iterative approach. There are a lot of things that go wrong in science. And sometimes it's things like getting the wrong sample, administering the wrong gene therapy. And sometimes experiments don't work and things just come out wrong. But I think this iterative approach in science is really important. And I think people get a lot of negative press. People have to face a lot of public berating, things like that, which is unfortunate because it's part of the process of science, I think, in a lot of cases. And I'm really impressed by people who are able to recover from these situations and go on to have successful careers. So was there anything in particular that helped you in that moment where things were coming crashing down around you, to get back on the horse and keep going again?
Well, I think that I'm just genetically resilient, and that helps a lot. But I also had a lot of support. So my chair at the time was really supportive, and the institution was supportive. I mean, publicly they had to hold me responsible, but by most people I didn't feel demonized. I felt supported. So it was internal resilience and then getting key external support.
Well, wonderful story to share with our listeners today, Jennifer, but we don't just want to talk about your tough times. So can you tell us next about a success in your career? And this can be a big success, like a grant, a paper, a big laboratory experiment working well, or just a little victory along the way.
There was a big change in our laboratory approach when we started doing the sequencing of human tumors, which really wasn't all that long ago. And I like to think of the era before we did this as playing a little bit in the dark. I mean, we understood our patients and we understood the results from our models, which were primarily cell lines, and then we put the cell lines into mice and we called them tumor models. But we weren't really capable of knowing what we didn't know.
Sure.
And then we were able to apply these sequencing technologies to the human tumors. And in 2011, with a lot of the collaborators, had a very high impact paper in the journal Science that really reported for the first time the compendium of mutations in human head and neck cancer. And that was followed up by a paper this year in the journal Nature of the Cancer Genome Atlas Consortium, or TCGA. And helping to guide this sea change in cancer biology has been enormously satisfying because it now allows people to go back and forth between the models that must be used for the laboratory because there's only so much we can do about their limitations, but then quickly go back into publicly available human data sets to see whether or not the findings in the laboratory models are consistent with what we're seeing in people with cancer and just validate the relevance. So that's been very satisfying to be part of that.
Certainly. So take us back to the moment. How did you feel? What was going through your mind when these big papers, these big projects coming to fruition came through?
Just really satisfying because it wasn't about me. It was about the team and it was about the field. It was about being able to share all this information that is required to be publicly available, which is a wonderful part of our funding system. And so it was just a privilege, really, to be at the table to get the information, see it, and then quickly get it out to the public so that lots of people can use it to do great things.
Wonderful. Well, Jennifer, does your lab have a particular way of celebrating some of these big accomplishments or milestones?
Oh, my goodness. Nothing immediately comes to mind. We sort of celebrate on a regular basis just because it keeps us happy.
So are these usually going out to lunches, dinners, things like that, or what do you guys do?
I bake a lab meeting. It's people's birthdays. We go out and enjoy each other and try to keep it light and diminish the tension of the inherent challenges involved in careers in science.
Absolutely. And demonstrate some of your master chef skills there. I like it. Now, Jennifer, we mentioned in the beginning of our interview that you are an avid reader, an enthusiastic reader, and I want to know what you recommend in terms of books that myself and our listeners can check out. And this can be a science book or a non-science book.
It's hard because I kind of read all the time, so it's a little difficult to jump to one book. There's some books I come back to over and over again, some writers that I'll just read anything. But I guess a book that has a little bit of a science theme that to me was surprising that I liked it so much was Elizabeth Gilbert's recent book, The Signature of All Things. I mean, I'd read like everybody Eat, Pray, Love and saw the movie and kind of had pegged her as a certain kind of memoirist. And this is really a novel, and it's a novel about a woman scientist in America, in Philadelphia, in the 1800s. And it was kind of a revelation to feel like this voice was so authentic at what it was like for a woman to be a scientist at a time when that was really quite uncommon.
Well, this sounds like a great book. We'll have to add it to our list. Now, Jennifer, what are you reading right now, if I may ask?
Oh, I'm reading Helen McDonald's H is for Hawk. It's great.
Awesome. We'll add that to our list as well. Listeners, we have got some reading to do. Now, Jennifer, as a scientist, not only do you get to work with fantastic people, you get to work on fantastic projects, but you also get to do quite a bit of traveling. So can you think back now on all of the places that you've been across the world for science and share with us an experience that is just your favorite or most memorable travel experience?
It's a hard one because when I think of travel, I think of the people and family, and going to meetings can be a little bit burdensome. It's more of a responsibility than it is a great joy. And I've always liked to have my mother come with me. My father doesn't like to travel very much. My mother loves to travel, and because my husband was busy with his career, my mother has been my travel companion, and we've really seen a lot of the world in conjunction with my responsibilities at scientific meetings. And maybe one of my favorite memories is going to a conference in Barcelona. It was a very good conference. It was a relatively small number of scientists from around the world, maybe 30 of us. It was a very focused meeting. The talks were stimulating. The city was beautiful. But what was most memorable was like everybody adopted my mother because people wanted to have a mother be there. And so I even had to leave the meeting early to go to another meeting, and several very senior and established cancer biologists in this country took my mother to dinner, and they still keep in touch with her, and that was enjoyable.
That is awesome. I think it's great to have a travel companion to come with you to some of these places, because sometimes you're able to extend the trip a little bit, do a little bit of extra travel at the end, or perhaps leave your mother behind and let her have all the fun. But
yes, exactly.
Well, Jennifer, this sounds like a phenomenal travel experience. So how much travel would you say you do now if you had to estimate as a percentage of times per month or times per year?
I'm trying so hard to reduce it because so many of the meetings are on the East Coast, and I'm realizing now that I live on the West Coast that that's a significant difference in terms of days, having days downtime because of the travel.
Sure.
I probably travel once a month at this point. That's probably the kinetics. And because I have a new job, I'm trying as best I can to reduce that travel so I can really dedicate myself to doing a good job.
So do you find it hard to say no to some of these great opportunities that are coming up?
Once you start saying no, it's okay. Nothing bad happens. The world isn't over. And if you disappoint people, it's unfortunate. But if you're clear that, I try to prioritize going to meetings where I think I'll learn a lot, or meetings in cities where where my children live, or I have family or friends, trying to keep it all in perspective.
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the challenges that a lot of scientists face. You're constantly getting requests for reviewing grants, reviewing papers, being on this committee, that committee, traveling for these different things, giving talks. It can be overwhelming sometimes. And I think you do have to draw that line, and you have to say no to some things.
Absolutely. Yes.
Well, Jennifer, great to chat about your travel experiences. And I think throughout the interview, we've chatted about some of these key people who've meant a lot to you along your journey as a scientist, and people who you're working with now who've had a big impact. And I want to talk about the human side of science. I think as a scientist, you're very serious about your work. You're very passionate about what you do, but you also have fun at the job. And it's great to work with your fantastic lab members and do great research. But you also have these little traditions, ways to celebrate successes, things that you do together. So can you share with us one of these stories of one of your current lab traditions, or just a funny memory, or even one from a previous lab?
Well, we just got here, so we don't have quite a tradition yet. They've only been here for a month.
Gotcha.
I started out by baking cakes for everybody's birthday, and that was really okay when it was 5 people, 6 people, 10 people, 12 people. And then it got to be hysterical. Mm-hmm. I was baking a cake every week.
Wow.
Because there were so many people in the laboratory, or part of the laboratory group. And at one point I thought, this has probably moved beyond.
This is not healthy, right?
Even a tradition. Now it's become a bit of a chore. So we had to put a stop on that. And we always try to do something fun. So, right before we left Pittsburgh, what we did is we took a little river cruise. Pittsburgh is filled with bridges and rivers, and there are boats that go up and down the rivers around the city. And I hadn't done a tour keeping in Pittsburgh probably forever. And we had people from all over the world in our laboratory. And so we headed out, warm day, and took a little tour around the city, and it was really fun. So we're talking about now here in San Francisco, just hopping on one of these tour buses and it's a laugh, just taking a tour around San Francisco so we can learn about it because we're all so new.
Well, that sounds like an awesome tradition to start your annual bus tour. I like it.
Yeah.
Well, and I love this cake tradition. I know we had the same problem in our laboratory. The problem was everyone's birthdays were clumped together. So September was just like cake all the time. But you have to break it down now. I think we do once a month. We try and celebrate all the birthdays. But it's a fantastic tradition and a great way to celebrate and acknowledge all the different lab members. So wonderful to hear about some of these traditions. And hopefully you'll be able to establish even more traditions as your laboratory grows there now in San Francisco. And we've talked a little bit about your research, Jennifer, but now I want to talk about the unanswered questions that you still have in your mind. So if we gave you everything today, if things like funding and staff and technology and feasibility were not a problem, you could do anything. Can you tell us what you would want to do? What question would you want to answer?
I think it's really the precision medicine question. I'd like to figure out how I can sample every patient's tumor and create rapidly a really reliable avatar and test the possible treatments in that avatar in such a way that it can rapidly feed back and guide us in the clinic. And that's just really hard. Most recently, we had an eye-opening experience where we had an exceptional responder to a drug that in unselected populations has proven to be completely inactive in head and neck cancer. And this patient had a mutation that we believe conferred response to the drug. And it turns out only 1% of patients with head and neck cancer have this mutation. So when you bring in the realities of insurance companies and reimbursement and testing, I mean, do you do a test on 100 people, 9 of whom will be negative, to find that one patient who's going to be cured with this one drug? And the answer is probably not.
Right.
But if you're the patient with that mutation, you'd sure like to know. So there are a lot of realities that really make it hard to achieve this promise.
Now, do you think with sequencing becoming more accessible and available and even more available on an individual scale, is this something that could in the future have more promise?
Yes, but of course, how do we get there? So we at UCSF, as well as other places, are trying to bring targeted sequencing, particularly into the oncology arena. And for better or for worse, the vast majority of insurance companies won't pay for it. They want to pay for testing that is clearly clinically indicated and clinically meaningful. So where do you get the resources to do this testing in the experimental phase so that ultimately you can come out in a CLIA lab and in a practice that you can defend to the providers so that it can be compensated? So there's just this real gap between discovery and application that is really hard to get funded with anything other than philanthropy. And so that proves to be a real rate-limiting step for most institutions.
Gotcha. Well, very interesting question, though, and certainly something we can look forward to in the future, perhaps moving closer to that direction and being able to address some of these rare mutations and help people who have these problems that might not be covered by their insurance company. So very interesting. And now we've talked a little bit about all the people that you've been able to work with and some of these main mentors that you've had along your journey. And I want to know, do you have a particular piece of advice that you've received, Jennifer, that has really had a big impact on you that you could say is the best piece of advice that helped you along the way?
For me, it's always been focus, focus, focus. Everything's interesting, everything's shiny and new, but the surest way to derail a career is to do everything superficially and nothing deep. And the way things work in academia and academic medicine and science is to go deep, to establish a reputation, to be the person who's known for this. And then you can have the luxury of experiencing and testing other things.
Sure.
So going too wide and superficial, particularly at a young age, can really prevent one from developing a reputation, which really is the lifeblood of promotion.
So is this something you struggled with? Did you have broad interests going into it and have to hone them in?
Oh, absolutely. Everything's interesting.
Right.
And luckily with my husband, he kept saying, nope, keep your eyes on the prize. Don't go to all those meetings. Pick and choose the meetings that you go to. Pick and choose the things that you're going to study and make sure you get this down first before you add number 2. And that was good advice.
I think this is great advice because I know myself going into graduate school, I wanted to do everything. I did 5 rotations before I finally picked a lab because everything was so cool. I couldn't choose.
Right.
Fantastic advice. Now, is there any other last piece of advice, Jennifer, or any last note of inspiration that you'd like to end our interview on today?
I think that for me, the most important thing is know yourself. Know who you are, know what your capacities are, and know what makes you happy. And make sure that on a regular basis, daily if you can, do those things that make you happy. Because if you are happy, everything else is tolerable. All the other disappointments and frustrations can fall into place. And then the other thing is accept imperfection. If you want to do it all, quote unquote, if you want to have a clinical life and a science life and a family and hobbies and friends and whatever, you're going to probably be imperfect in each and every role. But it's good enough. The combination is intensely satisfying, that accepting one's imperfections turns out to allow you to enjoy a diverse set of career ambitions and life fulfillment.
Well, I think this is fantastic advice. I know a lot of scientists, including myself, tend to be perfectionists. So it is so hard sometimes to accept imperfection, but so important to be happy. So yes. Wonderful advice for our listeners out there. Jennifer, can you tell them now how they can reach out if they want to learn more in you and your phenomenal work?
Sure. Feel free to email is the best way. It's jennifer.grandis@ucsf.edu.
Perfect. Listeners, definitely reach out if you have any questions. And Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a piece of your story.
My pleasure.
It was a pleasure to chat with you. And listeners, thank you for joining us as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to seeing you next time on People Behind the Science.